Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining. We'll give just a few minutes before we start to let everyone join in and settle in the call. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Chahira. We were waiting for you and for Thomas. I think, Manu, we can start now. We have Chahira here.
Yeah. Thomas. Oh, yeah. There he is. Actually, perfect.
Actually, our camera and the microphone were deactivated, so thank you for activating them.
Perfect. Well, if you guys don't have a problem, I think to not lose more time, we can start. Yeah. So, Mariana, we can present in full screen. Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second of 5 webinars in the Gamer Project. First of all, we would like to thank you for all coming and making time in your busy schedules. We're thrilled to continue this series after having the first webinar back in June. Today's webinar is called Cracking the Code, How Gamer Decoded Europe's Gaming Clusters. I'll quickly introduce the project, but I'll let our speakers go into more detail about it. Gamer is a 36-month research initiative funded by Horizon Europe and UK Research and Innovation, focused on understanding how local and regional video game clusters emerge, grow, and sustain themselves across Europe. The project addresses a critical gap in existing research, which often overlooks smaller clusters and regional ecosystems in favor of major cities or global hubs. It is important to emphasize again that it is a 36-month project, which means it is a work in progress, and the research our colleagues will be presenting today is not the final outcome. This webinar series is one of the ways we bring this research to life. Over the next few months, we'll highlight the project's findings, explore innovative methodologies, and open up space for dialogue between researchers, policymakers, and industry professionals. And before we dive into today's topics, allow me to briefly introduce today's esteemed speakers. From our CRG team that are part of the Gamer Project that will be presenting today, we have Chahira, who is a research engineer at the École Polytechnique's Management Research Center. She's also co-founder and CEO of Makers Factory, an incubator dedicated to digital, cultural, and creative industries, supported by the French Institute in Tunisia, and along with many other accolades that she holds. And her peer, Thomas Paris, is a researcher at CNRS and an associate professor at HEC Paris, who holds a PhD in management science. His research focuses on the economy of creation and the creative industries. He is also the director of the Master Media Art Creation at HEC Paris. And for our invited experts today, we have Jari-Pekka Kaleva, is an institution nerd helping the game industry's geeks to revolutionize the world we live in. At the moment, he works as managing director at the European Game Industry Umbrella Organization and as chief policy advisor at Neogames Finland Association. He has more than a decade of experience tracking both national and EU level political decision making from the game industry's point of view. And 𝗔_P van 7 is a veteran of the global game industry with over 27 years of experience in creative entrepreneurship, game incubation, and ecosystem acceleration. As managing director of Dutch Game Garden, he has helped and mentored over 300 game startups and scale-ups, and has been a key figure in shaping Europe's game development landscape. With a background in industrial design, engineering, and game development, 𝗔_P brings a cross-disciplinary approach to supporting creative professionals. He advises national and local governments in the Netherlands on creative industry policies, and is an active member of international advisory boards. We're honored to have such a knowledgeable and experienced panel with us today. We kindly ask that you hold any questions until the end of the session, when we'll open the floor for a Q&A session with all our speakers. And now, enough from me. With that, I'll now hand it over to the research team to begin the presentation. We hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Mariana. I'm just going to share the screen, and
Yeah, no problem.
can you just allow me to do the sharing?
You should be able to do it by now, Chahira. Let me know if you can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, all
yeah,
good.
Okay. Thank you so much, Manuel, for this introduction. So we are doing to have a Two Voices presentation with Chahira. We are very excited to present this ongoing research, which is a very important research and a very heavy process. We will present, first, we will remind the objectives of Gamer Project. Manuel already introduced them. Then we will have some insight about what is the creative cluster from the academic viewpoint. And then we find important to present the way we developed our methodology in order to let you be able to understand what our results. And we will present our first results. And once again, it's a work in progress. We are at the middle of the path, and so we have some first results we will be able to present. Thank you, Chahira. So, as Manuel introduced, the objective of the Gamer project is to better understand how video game clusters do emerge, develop, and sustain themselves, and with a specific focus on non-capital regions in Europe. And so we are working on 6 different clusters in 5 different countries, in Portugal, in Scotland, in France, in Italy, and in Czech Republic. And we are a big academic team composed by diverse universities. And a very important point is that we have we do this research with different approaches, and so the comparative approach is a very, very fertile process, but also which carries some difficulties, and we want to take some time to remind these difficulties. First, because this is important, in the notion of cluster, you all may know that it was a notion popularized in the economic literature in the end of the last millennium. The notion of cluster deals with a situation in which, in a certain locality, in a certain region, there is a kind of economic dynamism led by the relationship between companies, corporate companies, startups, institutions, and universities. And this is a very specific economic dynamism. And we know from long time now that clusters are very active and very important in the creative industries. We don't really perfectly know why and how they do work, but there was much research about the way clusters do emerge and do work in the creative industries. The best example maybe Hollywood in California. An important point in our research is that this importance of clusters in the creative industries could lead to some quick, how would I say, could lead to some very easy ideas, very easy principles. And you may remember that in the beginning of the century, the notion of creative cities had a huge success, and creative cities was based on the constatation that clusters had a huge importance in the creative industries, and this led some researchers and some public policy officers to have a kind of reverse reasoning and to consider that they needed to have some clusters in order to have some dynamism in the creative industries. And in this period, many public policies did focus on how to have some clusters, how to facilitate the gathering of different players in the creative industries. And this was quite fallacious reasoning. And so this is important in our research to prevent from these kinds of reasoning and to have a very modest approach about the cluster in the creative industries and specifically in the video game industry. And so we are trying to understand what are clusters, how do they work, and to which extent they can be a source of economical dynamism or creative dynamism. Maybe you can, and so this is very important to understand how the methods we decided to develop, and we will come back to this point. Let us present the scope of the study. The first important point to have in mind is that we decided to work on 6 clusters, but they were selected only on reputation criteria, and so there is no a priori homogeneity between these clusters. And as you may see on the right, the clusters are very different. They belong to territories with very different characteristics. Torino, Lyon, or Bordeaux are very big cities or huge regions, whereas Dundee and Fondao are less important in size. The clusters in these cities did emerge at very different times. In the video games industry, this is very important to have in mind, because the year 2000 in the video game isn't the same than today, because in 2000 the video game industry was still a publishing industry, physical publishing industry. It is not anymore now. And maybe the last difference between these different clusters is the size of the video game industry, the size and the relative size. In Fondao and in Bordeaux, the sizes are very different, for example. Maybe, Chahira, you could develop some first commonalities we could observe in the research in these clusters.
Indeed, thank you, Thomas. Actually, there was a first set of main commonalities, main differences, which were already already underlined during the beginning of the project. And these 2 points were important for us in order, because one of the major outputs of this project is to provide a decision maker with a typology that could enable other decision makers or private firms who wants to develop such cluster. So as underlined earlier by Thomas, there's this major aim of research toward which we are striving, but at the same time, we don't want to fall into these drawbacks and the idea that or preparing some kind of recipe, a prepackaged recipe or miracle recipes. And I think many of you are already aware of this, the increased popularity of the creative cluster and how afterwards there was much questioning about their relevance, about this presupposed performance of creative cluster and how they can deliver on their promises. So that's why the theoretical sampling was one important part. It was achieved before the beginning of the project and based on this first set of commonalities. So the idea at the beginning was to look, of course, into cluster specialized in video game industry, but here one of the major point was what do we intend and what do we call creative cluster. And one of the main point was to separate or single out clusters where the major companies were dedicated to the video game development, and especially on 2 major activities, the development and publishing activities. Of course, there's the criteria of localization in the European Union, and the other thing was another interesting aspect was to look into clusters situated not in major capital cities or metropolitan areas, but more in rural regions or medium-sized cities. So the other interesting point was the recognition of the cluster, and not only an internal recognition, but also the external recognition of the cluster, because we have many agglomeration we can observe many agglomeration of video game companies. But another interesting thing was this internal but also external recognition of this agglomeration as a cluster. And of course, another interesting common thing is the diversity in stakeholders. So not only companies dedicated to video games development, but also training institutions, universities, research labs. So because this is also one of the major identifying point of cluster in general and creative clusters specifically. So the other interesting thing is, apart from the size, as you underlined, Thomas, there's also the difference in the maturity, and this is one of the richness and the interesting points in this theoretical sample. So we have clusters which emerged during the 80s and evolved, especially with some anchor firms like Lyon, Bordeaux, or Dundee. And we have cluster which emerged more recently. The most recent one is Fondao, and it's interesting addition to this theoretical sampling, because we are Fondao is really currently in some kind of emergence or gestation phase, and it is interesting to look into how many stakeholders are collaborating in order to launch this cluster. Brno case is also interesting in that even if the formalization or let's say the agglomeration exists already during the 80s, the recognition of the cluster became much later afterwards during the 2020 and formalized especially through the creation of the formal association. The other interesting thing also is the geographical perimeter, and we are going to develop this point afterwards. But what's interesting is is that even if we are speaking about cluster, automatically it entails an agglomeration, geographical agglomeration. Here we have many differences regarding the concentration of these companies and these stakeholders, and also the perimeter of the cluster. And another interesting thing is that this perimeter is not only about the geography of the cluster, but it's also generally related to the public policy, how the regions or territories are defined at the national level. So this is also another interesting thing, and the variety in our theoretical sampling is interesting regarding this aspect. Yes,
Shaya,
I'm gonna
wait,
let you.
yeah, and can you come back to the previous slide? Because
Yes.
no, previous one, please. Previous.
This one?
Yeah, this one. So an important point, following what I said about the risk of shortcomings, we have to deal with non-consistent categories. A cluster is not a cluster, is not the same as another cluster. And in order to be able to have some recommendations towards the public policy officers, we need to be able to have an understanding of the differences between this cluster. And in the same vein, a video game company doesn't mean anything, because a video game company can has its own IP, it can act as a subsidiary, and so on and so on. And so we need to have a more fine-grained approach in order to be able to have some useful to build some useful knowledge towards the policy making. And so, which is important in our approach of building a typology, is that it's a policy making oriented typology. And you can go on the methodology, please. Next one. So previous one, please. No. Next one.
This one?
No. The number 7, please.
Okay.
Page 7. We are involved in an important team, and the work about the comparison and the typology is a kind of abductive and iterative work between the field work, which is done by the different universities in their clusters, and the cross-case comparative analysis. It is very important to have this approach, because the field work nourishes the comparison, and with the comparison we are able to have a more precise field work. And this is the main methodology we developed, and we are now present the more specific methodology in order to build a typology from this field work. Next one, please. How did we work? We work mainly with two different protocols. The first one, we led some interviews in the different clusters, about 20 to 40 interviews in the different clusters with different kinds of players in the clusters, developers, owners, institutions, universities, and so on. But we also searched some secondary data, and we also carried a document analysis to have the most complete understanding of the clusters in a longitudinal perspective, because in order to be able to understand the dynamics of a cluster, we also need to understand the way the cluster did emerge, the way the cluster did grow, and so on. What did we search in this research? For different aspects, but we will present these aspects later in the following. One very important thing is to to resist the temptation of a typology, a taxonomy, which would be universal and descriptive. We are not biologists. Biologists have a vision of all the species that exist in the nature, and from this global sample, they need to organize these species into a taxonomy. We are not in the same approach because we have only 6 clusters. They are chosen quite at random, and so we need to build a typology considering only 6 clusters. What is important in this slide is to say that we are in a scientific approach, but a scientific approach oriented towards decision making. That is to say, the typology we are trying to build is a typology that is structured by questions that policymakers can raise. In this research, and considering this temptation or this risk, we are driven by different issues. And maybe the first issue is the chicken and egg question. We know that clusters are an important reality in the creative industries and in the video game industry, but does that mean that we need to have clusters in order to have dynamic industries, local industries? And behind this important question lies the question of the public policy to tell things in another way. When we consider the different clusters in the video game industries, most of them were born in an organic way. And so the underlying question is to which extent the public actors can have an impact on the birth of a cluster and on the dynamism of a cluster. And I think this is our main question. And in order to be able to answer this question, we want to have a more fine-grained approach and to consider the different kinds of cluster, what kind of clusters toward what kind of policy yeah, sorry. So what kind of clusters and what kind of policy? We try to understand why some clusters are more fruitful and performant than other ones, and we try to link their performance to some factors, and we will come back to these different factors. So here's the underlying global issue that structure our work on the typology and the comparison. You can go on. Maybe we had a process in different steps, but we are going to present the two most important steps, the first one and the last one. We wanted to have the largest view on the clusters in the first stage. So we did identify the different dimensions that were involved in the cluster's dynamic in a literature review, and we did a quite exhaustive list of these dimensions in order to have a very complete analytical grid in the beginning. That was the first stage of our research, and we organized these different dimensions into 4 main areas. 2 of them are related to the macro holistic viewpoint, that is to say the cluster considered from a global point of view, and 2 other areas gather some questions related to the more individualistic viewpoint, that is to say the cluster from the viewpoint of the company that are involved in the clusters. because one of the questions we raise is to which extent being a part of a cluster can be important for a company, for its development, for example. And in a second stage, can go on. We did isolate what seems to us to be the main structuring dimensions. And we need to have this intermediate stage in order to be able to build a typology, because we did observe that on the 4 dimensions that I will present, we have we can build some typology. We can build some sub-typologies. One typology about the cluster emergence and genesis. We did observe through the work on these 6 clusters that the way the cluster did emerge was very, very different. A second important dimension on which we will be able to build a typology is the cluster evolution. How is the cluster dynamics? How does it works? Third dimension about the characteristics of the cluster, the local industry features and its components. And the fourth dimension is the collective actions, because as we will see in the clusters we observe, some of them are involved a very, very important and powerful association with an animation role, and other one work in a more organic way. You want to comment this, Chahira? Or?
Yes, actually, regarding if now, and I will stress the point you already mentioned, Thomas. This is really an ongoing process, and we deem it necessary to explain the approach, because we needed also to combine the rigor and validity, some kind of a methodological validity within our approach, but at the same time having tools which are empirically grounded and which are also flexible and useful for the decision maker and private actors who also are involved in the management of a video game cluster. So if you look into this, actually we are not going to delve into each one of these trajectories of the evolution of our studied clusters. But what's interesting here is if you look rapidly into these different figures, you can see that we have an important heterogeneity. Actually, even when doing the study, we discovered the different team discovered that we have more heterogeneity than we anticipated, and actually it's an interesting thing, but it also have some ambivalent impacts into our results. So, for example, if I take some examples for Bordeaux case, what we thought was one single unified cluster, actually we noted that there were 2 geographical localities, Angoulême and Bordeaux, and actually we needed to look into this two separate localization which merged afterwards. If we take the case of Lyon too, we noticed also that the trajectory was some kind, not linear one, but was punctuated by many crises, many rebirths, if we can label it so. So this heterogeneity, actually we are trying right now to with the different teams to have unified categories and to have unified tools in order to nurture this the different typology we are going to produce. Also, if we look into the other dimensions you highlighted, Thomas, if you want me to go through the main commonalities and then I let you present the main differences. Okay. the first thing is that actually, as we underlined above, one of the main things we wanted to understand is identify the main commonalities, but afterwards the main differences. So one of the interesting points, we have many interesting and common points to this cluster. One of the first things, and if we look into the emergence of this cluster, is the existing of founding events. Sometimes these events are not always positive events, but sometimes, and in many cases, it was a crisis. This event was crisis, negative effects, sometimes the disappearance of anchor and important firms, and they acted as catalyzing factor. So if you look into Lyon, for example, you have the closure of Infogrames. It is the same for Bordeaux. For Dundee, the event was more the success of Lemming and afterwards of GTA. For Turin, it was also an event, first edition of Global Game Jam taking place in 2014. And in Bordeaux and Fundão, you have also this the events, but it's more like gathering events. For Bordeaux, it was between the local studios, first informal meetups, whereas for Fundão, it was more the strategy of the municipality and the gathering of formal stakeholders who decided to launch this cluster. Another interesting thing also is the absence of the historical precondition and links with the video game industry. So if we look into Dundee, Turin, all of this cluster, what they share in common is that they have no preconditions, no link to pre-existing assets or pre-existing industrial firms which are related to the video game industry or can serve as a ground to the development of such an industry. Another interesting part is the role of spin-off waves, but here we need to underline the fact that these spin-off waves, even if they are common to all the clusters, they intervened at different moments. So if you look at Lyon or Bordeaux, who have in common the disappearance of anchor firms, so these anchor firms, they led to two waves of spin-offs, many collaborators. So there was an important brain drain, but the many collaborators, they choose also to create their own studios, small studios locally, and to remain in the region. In Dundee, there's the role of GMA Design and the local university, who both helped this through their entrepreneurial program. And for GMA, also it sparked a spin-off wave, and both they enabled the formation and development of many small studios. For Brno, it was the market opportunities related to the subcontracting. So many entrepreneurs who were working as subcontractors for many major editors, they also choose to create their own studios. And for Torino, we have also these similar effects through the OGR incubator. Another also common point is the critical and supporting role of university. Once again, like for the spin-off waves, even if it intervened at different times of the cluster's evolution, they all have in common this critical role of university. And they some of the clusters like Lyon, Bordeaux, or Dundee, they have universities since their inception. The other ones, they saw the emergence of university training programs dedicated to the video games sector afterwards. But all these programs and training actors, they actually served not only as pipeline of talents, but also they enhanced the legitimation of the clusters. They served also as spaces of professional socialization, and they acted as as incubators, to spark and to help the formation of new generation of studios. The other important common points also, one of them is well documented in the literature about the clusters. It's the existence of a first core of a network. So it's not only individual brokers or small companies, but there's also the importance of a certain density in terms of social capital, in terms also of social proximity, of cognitive proximity between the different components and actors composing the clusters. So this is also another interesting common point. The other point is, even if there are many differences and we are going to develop them, but still what's common between all these clusters is that they mainly constituted by studios, developing firms, and a huge part, a main bulk of these studios are very small companies and firms, sometimes individual companies, freelancers working for their own account. And the last important things, it's more an aggregate aspect, but what also we noted that all of these clusters, they have they face the same tensions, the same paradoxes, which so they have more or less the same leverage mechanisms, but they face the same issue, and especially how to calibrate this mechanism. For example, the first one is the perimeter of the cluster, whether it is a closely knitted cluster with a closely knitted structure, or more open cluster, a more porous cluster with a lot of collaborative links and projects and extra-territorial links. Or otherwise, on the other hand, we have some cluster who are very, I wouldn't say closed, but are more dense, and they have more intra-cluster links and collaborative project. So this is for the commonalities, but we have also, and that's what's interesting, and what will serve as the foundation of the typologies, is the differences between this cluster, and we strive to organize these differences in order to enable the construction of the typology afterwards. Thomas, do you want to develop this? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chahira. And so maybe the differences are also very, very fertile in order to understand the different kinds of clusters, and we need to have this intermediary stage with sub-typologies in order to afterwards being able to build a global typology. About the cluster emergence and genesis, the 6 cases we studied allowed us to make appear some different dynamics of emergence and genesis. The first one, it's quite very interesting, is maybe the existence of a big company in the video game industry, and this is the examples of Dundee, Bordeaux, and Lyon. With some important insight. The first one is that in Lyon, Infogrames, which was one of the main video game players in the first years of the video game industry in France, did settle in Lyon quite at random. So there were no initial conditions. They did settle in Lyon because the founders have some links with Lyon. But more interestingly is that in Bordeaux, the first important event which triggered the dynamism of the cluster is the collapse of a company. So Bordeaux, as Lyon, as Dundee, did host an important company in the video game industry, Callisto. And the birth of the cluster was the consequence of the collapse of 𝗖𝗆𝗏, because 𝗖𝗆𝗏 let many talents in Bordeaux. These talents didn't want to leave Bordeaux. They didn't want to leave the video games industry, so they were compelled to create their own company. And so the collapse of 𝗖𝗆𝗏 has for a consequence the creation of several companies, and the links, the relationship between these companies was a kind of consequence of the difficulty to build a company in the video game industry after the collapse of 𝗖𝗆𝗏, because every entrepreneur who wanted to create a company in the video games industry did face a kind of hostility from the institutions, from the banks, and so they had to develop a kind of solidarity, and the cluster did emerge from this initial collapse. A second kind of emergence is the very important public policy strategy, and this is specifically the case of 𝗏𝗏. We can also observe an important support in other clusters, but the initial support as the initial funding event is very, very specific to 𝗏𝗏. And a third important trigger of a cluster dynamism is the integration of a training actor, a university, and this was the case in Angoulême, for example, which is the other part of the cluster of Bordeaux. And the starting point of the video game industry in Angoulême was the creation of 𝗔𝗌, a public school, a university dedicated to the video game industry. And so on this dimension of the emergence and genesis, we can observe very, very diverse, very, very different dynamisms. The second dimension is the way the cluster does evolve, how is it nurtured and how it evolves. And we can also observe different engines. One of them is the creation of business of startups by young graduates. And this is the case in Dundee, this is the case in Bordeaux, this is the case in Lyon. The video game industry is nurtured by the creation of startups, by graduates who decide to stay in their in the place they did graduate. Second engine is the attractiveness of large companies or attractiveness of seniors of the industry. And these are two different engines, but they quite work together. And for example, Bordeaux was able to attract a studio by Ubisoft because of different characteristics, some of them related to the industry and the presence of a university, of talents, and so on, and some of them related to the quality of life, and this is very important, in order to be able to attract some seniors. Third engine, the public support and the public policy strategy, which is very structuring. And another engine is, we did not mention spin-offs, which is another engine of creation of companies. This is the case in Lyon. Many spin-offs from Infogrames were created. And these are some elements of the dynamism of the clusters. The third dimension, Chahira, you can go on.
Sorry.
The third dimension is about the characteristic of the cluster, so the local industry features and components, the demography of companies, and we also observe different kinds of clusters. I take the example of several dimensions are involved. The first one is the size of the cluster, and among the cluster we observe, some of them are very concentrated. For example, Dundee or Fondao, and some other ones are very extended. For example, Bordeaux, the cluster of Bordeaux covers the whole of Nouvelle-Aquitaine, one of the biggest regions in France. About the features and components, the role of association, professional associations, is a dimension which differentiates the clusters. It is very important in France. It is very less important in Scotland, for example, in Dundee. But what is very interesting, but Chahira told a few words about that, is that independently from the existence or not of an association, the activities led by the associations are always present. That is to say, the collective actions, this is the fourth dimension, and we will say a few words about it. The collective actions are always do always exist in the different clusters we observed. Collective actions are about networking, are about event organizations, are about education, and we find these different activities in all the clusters, but they can be taken in charge by one central organization, or it can be disseminated between different organizations. Maybe the time is flying. We can. I said a few words about the collective actions and the toolbox. So the toolbox refers to the different kinds of activities that seem to be very important in the cluster dynamism: networking, education, events, and so on. But we can go on maybe.
Yes, I think we finished, Thomas, but maybe we can take just 2 words about these 2 dimensions, I think, because they drained many debates among us, if you want.
Okay, one important point, we are focused on the clusters of the video games. We are questioning the role of the public policies and the toolbox of the public policies. But when we analyze these different clusters, we must observe that there are 2 important dimensions that we need to take into account about the perimeter and the critical mass. The perimeter is very variable according to the clusters, and the example of Lyon is very interesting because the perimeter of the cluster, the kinds of company which were involved in the clusters, did evolve in the history. The cluster was very open and did host companies in other industries than the video game industry. Companies in the IT, for example, or in the digital, and this openness was not really a success because it led to some one of the most important crisis in the history of the crisis. And so the cluster was born again with a more limited perimeter. The question of the critical mass is also very important because our first understanding is that the bigger is the cluster, the better it is. It is not really the case because the companies involved in the cluster know that if the cluster becomes too big, there will be some negative effects about the salaries of the talent, the wages of the talent, about the ability to have informal relationships, and so on. And so what we start to understand is that the cluster needs to have a critical mass, but needs also to keep in a controlled size and controlled perimeter. And maybe because we must conclude, maybe you can, yeah. Some concluding remarks. The first one is what we could observe in this research, ongoing research. First is the real importance of the toolbox, of the different tools that are present in all the clusters. The second important point is all the dynamics of the cluster is structured by the notion of talent. Many things are organized in order to attract talent, to keep talents, to be attractive to external talents, and so on. And so talent is the real fuel of the cluster. If we try to understand the inner dynamics of the cluster, we have to consider that talent is centric in the answer. Third important point is that in the history of the cluster, there were two game changers. The first one is the digital distribution. Before Steam, before the digital distribution, one of the main motivation or the main explanation of the clusters in the video game industry was the need to be in a kind of proximity to publishers. And this is not true anymore because nowadays with digital distribution, the companies don't need anymore to be close to the publishers. And the second game changer was COVID and remote working, because after COVID, some companies can exist in quite any place and in a total remote working organization. And we did meet some companies in Bordeaux, for example, who were created in Bordeaux, but working with people who are in Mexico or in other countries. And so the relationship to the territory, relationship to the cluster may have evolved because of these two game changers. I don't know, Chahira, if you want to comment some of the points in this slide before the conclusion.
Yes, actually, the other interesting points, and here we are speaking about the preliminary recommendation, which are going to fuel the construction of the typology. So, as you underlined earlier, one of the interesting aspects is this ongoing debate. It's common to all the cluster about the critical mass, but also about some kind of a debate or trade-off between the relational component and the quantitative component. So, are we, and this kind of trade-off, there's this course towards having more, especially the case of the formal organization, formal association. They are looking for more members, more diversity, and looking especially to have also very big players within the members. But as you mentioned earlier, the case of Lyon, for example, and the failure of Imaginov, because in the specific case of Lyon, for example, and 𝗖𝗇𝗇 was an initiative to open the collaboration with other sectors, so with other creative sectors, and it was also a collaboration. It was a movement of openness on research labs in order to promote R&D activities. But both were failures, and 𝗖𝗇𝗆𝗆, which came after 𝗖𝗇𝗇, was a movement toward more closer, if I could say. So it was toward reducing the scope of collaboration, focusing on the video game industry, focusing on the basic collective activities, but on the same time, it was they opened more collaboration with other clusters operating at the national level and even with international actors like EGDF and others. The other interesting also and major factor which probably is going to influence the typologies we are going to produce is this kind of trade-off between formality and informality. So as you saw in our sample, we have a cluster who have really zero formalization and they work and they function pretty well, like for the Dundee example. And we have also heavily structured clusters such as the French cluster who operates even since their inception, who operates through formal organization and formal strategy, especially collaborative strategies with public actors. The other one is the role of heterogeneity of the cluster. So there is this, as you said, there is this temptation to formalize some kind of different forms of trajectories. We don't want to fall into this trap and to try to modelize some kind of an archetype of evolutionary trajectories, but still we are observing many common interesting points, and that's probably is going to nurture a typology about the different kinds of evolution of clusters. And here we anticipate that the heterogeneity of the cluster is going probably to and forcibly to influence how it evolves and how which kind of collective action are going to prevail. But I think, Thomas, we took a lot of time, and we are going to stop here. We will underline once again that this is an ongoing process, and here we have with us GP and Jari. We are really happy to have you with us, and we would like to hear your feedbacks, your thoughts about what we presented, especially regarding through your experience of the other cluster. But I'm going to let Mariana and Manuel maybe formalize this.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas and Chahira, for your insightful presentation. We know you could talk about this for hours, so thank you for shortening it as much as you could. So yeah, any of the JPs, I think we can open up the panel discussion if you have any questions or comments about what you've seen with your prior experience.
Perhaps I start. I'm Jari-Pekka Kaleva, Managing Director from the European Games Developer Federation. We have members at the moment from 27 different European countries, and of course, clusters are a crucial part of the ecosystem building happening at the moment. And when I received the invitation and had a look on the research you had done, I feel somehow nostalgic because this whole cluster speak, and especially now that you mentioned Richard, Florida, that was like when I joined the industry, everyone was talking about creative clusters, creative class, how it's going to revolutionize everything. And then I walked through the memory line to the good old days of Framework Program 7 and all the cluster funding instruments, Horizon 2020 and a lot of cluster funding. And it feels like now that we are lobbying heavily on the European level, the multi-annual framework from 2028 forward, the concept of cluster is almost completely gone. And that's something I didn't really realize before this workshop. So thank you for highlighting that. That was a really interesting observation. So it feels like the heyday, the big days of the cluster policies, cluster building, all the debate around the clusters were around 2010s. Of course, all, as you described, started already before that. And over the years, like, I don't know, perhaps there's a bit of cluster hangover at the moment in the European ecosystem building, because let's face it, many of the clusters failed. Like that's one of the challenges that what you're focused here are of success stories. But I have seen so many stories about these kind of project-like initiatives in Portugal that just used lots of money for building a cluster, and just in the end, many people failed, that it was complete waste of public funding, and for almost a decade nothing happened, and then it kind of re-emerged. And there are also lots of these kind of frustrations when, for example, there are two cities in Finland called Kotka and Kouvola that are kind of forced to this kind of unwanted marriage to be a cluster, and they are internally doing everything they can not to be part of the same cluster, and there's internal struggle, but then there is just this kind of political mentality that you have to be now cluster, although there is no will on that. Or in relationship between Tallinn and Helsinki, where you kind of Helsinki doesn't really care about Tallinn perhaps that much. Of course, there's interesting happening, there are exchanges, but for the Tallinn game developer perspective, Helsinki is extremely important part of their framework. Or the relationship between Malmö and Copenhagen, to some extent, in many frameworks, they are not seen as completely different clusters, but there is much happening over the shorter distance, over the bridge, or same Vienna and Bratislava. And then the Arctic game that is northern Sweden tries to be a cluster over multiple cities, like huge distances between them, but somehow perhaps works. So and we try to use this concept of cluster to describe all of them. So it's makes it somehow really challenging. As I rightfully mentioned, the whole concept of cross-border remote work, that is where the game industry is forerunner, is definitely challenging. The very idea of the cluster and everything happening in certain locations. Now it's more about networks where people are located all around Europe and the world, and then you have companies in Berlin where the people are working from Finland and United States, and then you just make it work somehow, and that's a very different kind of network, kind of organization. But in the end, still, whenever I have been contacted by investors or publishers to where to open the next studio, or where to find talent or something like that, the talent is what they are talking. They're talking where are the talent hubs, where are the people, where is this kind of groups of people that would be in the same location doing the same thing, and what are the differences around them, like how the local public support instruments are shaping them, how the local educational institutions are shaping the talent, how the types of companies present are shaping the talent. Are they mobile oriented, are they console oriented, or something else? So there still is some kind of reality that the concept of cluster is able to reach. And also it plays a very vital role in giving this kind of joint meaning for the different actors in the field. And so also something you talk here in informality connections, because in the end, what makes perhaps a cluster is the joint strategy, some kind of joint understanding that we are going somewhere together. But my question for you would be more about like what comes after the cluster. Like it's clear that now we are talking, even I somehow just started to talk about ecosystems and not about clusters anymore. But what does the shift mean? Where are we heading with these clusters? And is there something really changing? Or is this just like, after a while we get bored with the old term, we don't get the public funding for it anymore in the research projects, and then we need to have a new term. And in the end, you just copy-paste a cluster with an ecosystem, and then you say, yeah, it's something novel and innovative, when in reality it's just the same thing in the different package.
Yes, thank you, Jari. I don't know if you want to have the other question, or we can answer Jari right now. Just rapidly, actually, what you are underlying, we also have the same thing in the academic literature. Right now, there's this huge debate about the notion of cluster of ecosystems, and even within ecosystem, we are speaking about business ecosystem, innovation ecosystem. Right now, we are also having a new concept, which is the meta-organization and meta-ecosystems. So we also have this, and we are having the same thoughts. But what's interesting is that we are, for example, really being challenged about the empirical reality behind all these concepts. So I would say, I would dare say that it's not just about looking for new concepts, new sexy concepts to have funds, but there's really real differences behind this conceptual or these different concepts, and that's what we are touching right now, if I could say so. Through these different case studies, I mean, the word, what was interesting is that the word cluster is already adopted by many professionals, and you feel it within your daily work, I think. And what's also interesting is that the notion of cluster is also being used when they are questioning the territoriality of this. I mean, we have today also concepts like the global value chain. We have the concepts of I mean, the ecosystem, they can also relate to dispersed, widely dispersed value chains. So actually, many of the clusters, if for example, the two clusters we are studying, Lyon and Bordeaux, they are also asking questions about their perimeter, especially if they have a lot of their workers right now who are situated elsewhere and not forcibly in France. Torino, for example, they also have the same issue. An important number of their professionals, they are outside of Torino, but still they work only with companies in Torino. So they are questioning also this reality of a cluster. And maybe we need to question one of the main assumptions of cluster, I mean, the geographical proximity. So that's maybe an idea to solve this issue and this contradiction or these differences between concepts such as the cluster and concepts such as the ecosystem. But actually, I think it's also interesting to have the feedbacks of GP. Yes, Thomas, you raise your hands. Yeah.
Yes, very interesting question, and thank you for your different inputs. I think there are two answers, and the first one is about the fad. There is a fad about some words, and they are very useful in order to get some money, and this is a reality. I'm not, and maybe the word which is the most fruitful today is AI. But I'm not sure that, and I'm not as close as you are from the European institutions, but I'm not sure that cluster is strong as it used to be 10 years ago. I was involved in the work by the French government about in the fad of the creative cities, and the French government had a reflection about how to have a cluster of the creative industries in Paris, and this was very, very strong at this time. I don't see the same importance to this fad today. But the other answer is that we can do this work without being obliged to take position about the concept cluster or ecosystem or meta-organization, because the notion of cluster is not the same in France and in other countries, and we had these difficulties that when we talk about cluster in France, we talk about the association which has an important animation role in the ecosystem. But what we are looking for is territories in which there is a density of players in the video game industry. And we are not obliged to use the concept of cluster and the concept of ecosystem. We just focus on these territories in which there is a density of players in the video games industry, in order to understand what is the role of this density. Is this kind of random? Has it a role in the dynamism of the local industry, and so on? And so we are not obliged to take position about this fads about concepts.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. In the comparing the six clusters, was there always an actor or an organization taking ownership of the cluster? Was there always an organizer?
No. This is an important point, and we in France are very. We've got a bias, because in France it is always the case, but when we study the cluster in other countries, and for example in Dundee, there is no centric player. But as we said, the kinds of activities that seem to be important in the cluster dynamism are taken in charge by other kinds of actors, and the university has a centric role. But there is no central association dedicated to the animation of the cluster in Dundee, for example, and in France.
Okay, and in analyzing what is important from a policymaker point of view, did you make any distinction between economic policymakers and cultural policymakers?
Good question. We should do. I think it's an important question. We should do, because I can't tell more about the situation in other countries than France, because we, Chahira and I, were focused on the two French cases, and in the French cases, this is an important reality, and there is this kind of duality between the involvement of the Ministry of Culture and the involvement of the Ministry of Economics, and the kinds of tools are not the same, the kinds of criteria in order to assess the projects are not the same, but we did not, to this point, make the distinction, and I think we have to do it. But maybe this will be the case mainly in France.
Right.
Actually, in the case of France, just to add here, for example, in Lyon, they needed, in Lyon case, because the public actors from both ministries, they agree and they work together, so it enhances, and it's a good thing for the cluster. Whereas in Bordeaux, they are not really very close, so this adds the work for the local organization, and this is maybe how we can integrate such differences in our typologies. I mean, the degree of concentration between the public actors, and either if these public actors, they already collaborate together, and so it's easy for the cluster to collaborate with public actors, or on the other hand, they are dispersed and they have very quite differing requirements, and on this case, it adds a lot of work for the local organization.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I add some point, because I think the question is important. One of the question of this research, and one of the bias in this research, is that we focus on the local level. The question about policy making and the question about impacts of policy tools can involve the question of the good level of action. Maybe the regional or local level is not the best one. In France, the situation is that the policy-making actions at the local levels are more focused towards the economic dimension. And at the national level, things are more the two are focused towards cultural objectives, towards economic objectives, and they are mixed. But in this research, we need to raise the question of the best action level. What we see in the French case is the interaction between the regional level and the national level. Is a very specific situation because there is also a cluster in Paris. And so the relationship between the associations, the local associations, are very ambivalent because the regional level knows that he needs to have some influence on the national decisions, but the local levels is also in competition with the capital association, capital games in France. And I think we have to think about this articulation between these two different levels and what is the good action level, if there is a good action level from the public policy side.
Okay. And if I'm looking at the first point, the important tools like event, network support, incubator, in comparing the 6 ecosystems, did you see some tools that you think are essential to be part of? Anything about effectiveness of and it ties in a bit to my question about ownership. Like, is there an organization that or an agent that feels ownership for the region or not? Did you see any learnings there?
Actually, what's interesting is that at some point between, in order to have a typology, we tried to fathom the different tiers of the collective action. And what's interesting, we tried also to see at what moment these collective actions or tools they emerged, or mechanisms. And what's interesting is that there are these basic tier of services or advantages which are provided for everyone. It goes from the sharing of information, from the organization of afterworks, of talks, of also sometimes it's also about connecting the right people with the right partners. So this is the kind of the basics and define even the existence of a cluster or not. But afterwards, what we observed is that we have more sophisticated services. And what's interesting here is how the studios and the cluster members are competitors regarding the studios. If, for example, we take the idea of having subsidized or financial help in order to participate in international conferences. For example, one of the also important services is the help to organize R&D projects, and it also drain a lot of public support for these two kinds of services. Here, since if one studio takes the amount of money, it's less for other studios. So we have more of strategizing between the studios, and here we have this kind of issues of ownership. So it's not about the organization driving the cluster who claims the ownership. It's more here we have some kinds of between the studios. And also what we observed, for example, is not a lot of cluster they go to this kind of services because they are difficult regarding their coordination, regarding their governance, and it can raise many issues. So, for example, for Lyon, they did some kind of a reverse back. So they have gone to the basics, the essentials. They have gone to, as Thomas mentioned earlier, they have gone to more, they looked more for collaboration with other clusters, and they tried also, but here what's interesting is that in order also to deal with this kind of multi-level scales of decision making, so they developed common projects with other regional associations. For example, they developed the 𝗵𝗔 formation, which is a training program, a commonly owned training program by two regional associations in Paris and in Lyon. They are also developing a common professional event in the north of France, which is owned by all regional clusters. We have 5 regional clusters in France. They have also developed 𝗔pense, which is a tool which calculates the carbon print of the video games.
Yeah.
So it's also owned by all 8 or 7 regional associations. So here the question of the ownership is important, but what's interesting to observe is that they did some kind of they are working on it at national level and through the different regional associations.
Okay. Do you feel policymakers, like, do you want the result of this project to be a recommendation to policymakers to invest in making clusters possible? Is that the hope, or is that what you're hoping to achieve? Because I assume you want to give something back to policymakers from this project.
I think we need to be agnostic. We need to consider that clusters are a reality in the video game industry, but we need also not to try to explain to the policymakers that they absolutely need to try to have some clusters, and this is I think this is key in the way we are doing this research. We don't consider cluster an objective a priori. Maybe the research will explain that it is very important to have some clusters. It is the question of the chicken and the egg that we introduced. Yes, clusters do exist, but do they exist because there is a dynamic local video game industry? Or you understood?
I just want to make more of a comment. I think we're running out of time, but I think one thing that I would be curious about in your research is the importance of a clubhouse or a building in the whole mix. Like, does a physical location make a difference or not? I have an opinion about that because we ran a physical location, but I would be curious, because sometimes that could be a university, that doesn't have to be a separate building, but you know, a place to meet, a place to interact, a place to do events. That's an interesting topic to compare, to see if you come up with any learnings on that.
Yeah, maybe just 2 words and I let Chahira complete, but it's a question raised also in other clusters, and for example, Lyon raised this question, but they have some administrative locals, but they raise the question to have some more convenient building or local, but they did not have such a building for years and years, and everything is okay, and they can organize some events in the different companies, and things are going like that. So I'm not sure there is a need for a kind of incarnation. This was also one of the simple ideas 10 years ago in the toolbox of the creative cities. We need to have a building, but no, the reality, what we observe now is this is not this doesn't seem to be the case. We can have a dynamic cluster without a totem building.
Okay.
Actually, what I wanted also to ask GP and Jari, are there other dimensions which, like this one, the physical, how to say, building, or as you said, the clubhouse? According to you, are there other dimension as decision maker? Are there other dimension apart from what we just mentioned who are important for you? And are there some kind of causal relationships about which you are curious, and do you think we need to look into this this dimension or this kind of causal relationships? Yes, GP.
Yeah, I mean, a big one is the presence of funding.
Yeah.
Are there any funding instruments in the region that make it interesting for people to be in that region, for example? Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's you had a quite well covered number of aspects. Perhaps something that wasn't really present in your analysis. I think I completely understand it because it's quite hard to measure. Is this kind of how to describe it? Like quite often there are clusters where there is a community and there is a lot of information is flowing inside the cluster. And then there are clusters that are like, well, not necessarily clusters anymore, but it's kind of places where there's lots of game industry people, but they are fighting with each other, and knowledge is definitely not shared. And there is very little information flows. And those things can have a drastic impact on the development of local ecosystems. For example, one of the reasons for some countries like Bulgarian game industry ecosystem, for example, is struggling is because they don't have this tradition of knowledge sharing. Whereas clusters in Helsinki region of Finland in general are quite open about supporting and sharing knowledge with each other. So that's definitely one of this kind of divisive line that is unfortunately a lot present in everyday discussions with the different clusters. Funding was already mentioned. That's definitely one of the big issues. Then what is new at the moment? Not necessarily to some extent inside Europe, because in Poland you have the strong Ukrainian presence and then Polish community, but especially in the countries like Serbia at the moment or North Macedonia, Armenia, there is this Russian game exodus that is completely isolated. So they are spatially in the same space, but there are two different communities and even the same language, necessarily in the same area. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. And of course, in many ways also on the wider social context, a big question about assuming that the current geopolitical tensions and crises go forward, how are we going to integrate these different communities into one community that works together? Because in the end, it's all about talent, but what if that talent is not really available for all the actors in the same ecosystem, however you want to conceptualize that? Yeah, but like perhaps like last point would be interesting to hear from you, JP, like Utrecht cluster and system was world famous at some point, and then it slowly started to decline. So is there something missing from this conceptualization of this project that would in a way explain the developments in Utrecht that led to this decline?
Well, it's hard to say. We had a 180 radical new policy in economic development. So because Utrecht is centered in Holland, we have a really big net congestion problem in the Netherlands with current going to companies and homes, so electrical power. And so the whole economic focus of startups went from one day to another, all towards that kind of solutions. So video games and video game companies was off the board in terms of a focus, and it was quite a drastic change in economic development focus for the region that kind of, you know, it came kind of without a warning. So it was, I'm not so sure how much I could have done to avoid what happened. I mean, you have to understand, we had a budget of 500,000 a year to do what we did. And we did a lot more than just we did a lot for the whole country. So we were funded locally, but we actually acted nationally, and that's maybe why we were so visible. We also did the national business event for the game industry. We came up with all sorts of things that we thought the industry needed, and we did a lot, stacking up. And the good news is the event is still happening. A new organization took it from us, so we had a monthly network lunch, and our branch organization has taken that to do. But we did a lot of stuff behind the scenes. I think my main task at some point was lobbying for money. That was my main job. And even though we were small, we were doing a lot of execution, but to lobby for money all the time from a regional perspective for actually efforts that were national. I feel that I should have been able to get part of our funding from our national government. But I do feel that part of our strength was that we didn't think regionally, but we thought nationally. And maybe there's a lesson in there that I do believe that clusters in one country, like say France, should work together to come up with a collaborative concept rather than competing for money or for I don't know, government interest in certain areas. But I feel our story is a bit unique, and I think one weakness, and that I've mentioned, kind of, we had a city and we had a province, and we should have had a third leg, which was national government as a funding tripod to create a certain kind of stability. And I think when one of the two legs was gone, we were done. It was finished. So I don't know, but I also sometimes it's just over. You know, they funded us for 17 years. For 17 years, we were able to do a lot of things, and I think the impact of what we've done, it will be noticeable for a long time.
Absolutely.
The companies are still in one building; they are still hanging out together. Now, what they are missing is one actor that is actively connecting things. I think that they're starting to notice the absence of our efforts. But on the other hand, I am not complaining. We did 17 years of being fairly well funded to do what we have to do. So yeah, but ask me again next year. I'm still trying to think through all this. You know, there's just so much that happened. It's
I think
I'm grateful that we were able to do what we were able to do. I do think a building, a place with a regular meetup every month. If somebody asked me what would you do in a city to make some kind of community going, I would just organize one event every month, always the same time, same day, something that people get used to, and just to connect people. I think that was one of the most effective things to stimulate collaboration. Yeah.
I think definitely it's something that absence of just game card will be seen in the long run. I've seen so many clusters where in the beginning everything just went forward as normal, but when for example, local incubator or accelerator was closed down, suddenly you didn't have new companies. You started to have less talent interested about joining the industry because there were not startup opportunities, and that slowly led to the decline of the whole ecosystem then. But I think that's one of the aspects perhaps for your project is this kind of long-term resilience of the clusters. What makes those clusters you are studying resilient on this kind of policy changes? Because over the time of not just 20 years, it happens over whatever is the parliamentary or local election term. It's 5 or 4 years, things change all the time. And there is something that keeps them resilient.
Yeah, and even as a regional cluster, have a national mindset.
Okay.
I think it's important. Yeah.
Just gonna ask a last question, Mariana. Are we running out of time?
Yeah, I need
Just
to run.
rapidly.
Yeah, I need to go too, but go ahead. If
Yeah,
you
just
have
one, because I think one of the clusters, and even a cluster, I think Dundee, but clusters also in France, they are thinking more like, you know, a classical incubator accelerator, and they are thinking about investment funds. And actually, this is one, and just GP, you used the same sentence as the two person we interviewed from both clusters. Their work 80% of the time is looking and lobbying for money. They use the same sentence. So, and one way for them, one of the weaknesses is how to lessen this dependence on public funding. And one way they're currently thinking about it is having this classical approach as incubator, accelerating, and having an investment fund. What do you think about it? Have you observed other things at the European level or at your country level?
Wait, so having a... Yeah, go ahead, JP.
Yeah, what's the exact question? Because
one solution would it be to have an investment fund, classical investment fund, like other incubator accelerator?
Well, I think I mean an investment fund is definitely important. It doesn't necessarily solve your funding problem, because an investment fund needs to be its own entity, and it needs all the money it has to revolve its own system. But the presence of a fund like that can be very beneficial for the cluster. It's one of the biggest challenges, and I saw the thing about the conflict with the movie industry in Torino. I wonder if it had to do with attaining public funding, because there's always the old cultural disciplines did not like the Dutch game in the game industry in the Netherlands, didn't like us to show up as well. So there's an issue there. But I think I'm afraid cluster efforts will always be largely dependent on public funding, unless you have a large scale economy of scale. And for me, the easiest place to get private money into the ecosystem was through events, so event sponsorships and things like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So just my 2 cents on this. So it's first of all a question of, are we talking about private seed funds or venture funds, or are we talking public equity funding? On the private funding side, this is a topic that pops up every now and then. Like perhaps once in half year, someone in Europe gets this idea and contacts me, and then I share the challenges they are facing. The main issue is that, generally speaking, if you want to run a profitable, self-standing, self-sustaining venture capital fund, the minimum size is around 20 million euros.
Yes.
That's a lot of private money, especially on the regional size. So what we have seen is that sometimes this kind of more charity-based funds have been able to raise perhaps few millions. So it's more like a project like Mid-Game Fund in Netherlands. So it can play a role, it can be important. It's absolutely necessary during the investment winter to have alternative sources for startup companies, because let's face it, most of the first round startups go bankrupt. So it's extreme risk financing, and that's the reason why we would need public equity funds. And that's then the question of something that was on my table on Monday, general block exemption regulation. What are the EU rules on what kind of public equity funding is allowed on what under what terms? And then the second part is also convincing public support instruments that equity funding actually makes sense and have the skill sets for that, because all our public support is basically tailored for grants, perhaps loans. But there is very little public expertise on running this kind of equity funds. There are some examples of that. EIT, KIC, Culture and Creativity is experimenting that. There are some regional equity funds in Berlin, in Kajani, and so on. They have been quite successful, and they're making risk financing. But there is very little success stories to benchmark. And secondly, then convincing people that you should use the public money or especially EU money for building something like that, and then overcoming all the regulatory challenges, like in the worst case you have to notify in Brussels, that's a lot of work. So brave pioneers would be needed on that, but I still believe the idea it would be important for the local ecosystem to have a seed funding for the new companies.
Great message, I think, to end this webinar. I'm very sorry, we really need to end here. It's over time, 15 minutes. So we appreciate everyone that could stay a little bit longer, and especially a great thank you to all the speakers. It was an amazing discussion. It really shows that we have still a lot to discuss, and there's a lot still to be done, but there are definitely very encouraging and key messages that we will take away with us. We'll be sending also an email for all the participants to make sure that they can answer regarding what was the webinar according to them. And please join us in the upcoming series of this webinar program. Again, thank you very much to all of you, and a special thanks to Chahira, Toma, and the two GPs. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.